been running. Today's session is brought to you by AEST Insurance, and Jay McGrath will be talking through bullying and how it relates into the workplace. So once again, thanks for attending. We've got over 30 people that have now registered, which is great to see that these are being used. This webinar is being recorded, so feel free. We will send out the link of the recording at the end, as well as Jay and Simon have put together a really handy workbook. We will send that out after the webinar as well, so that you can send these around and use them within your own organisations. Really good resources for your supervisors, line managers, and possibly being able to incorporate some of it even into your inductions as you move forward. So this program and series of webinars has been developed out of the Safety in the Meat Industry project that we're currently working on, and we thank everyone for their time and their involvement so far in the project. So we really encourage questions today. If you've got a question for Jay, please feel free to type your question in the toolbar and send it across, and I will politely interrupt Jay throughout his presentation so that we can try and get the questions completed. So thanks, Jay, for your time today, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, as Amanda said, we're going to work through this stuff. We've got a bit of time to talk through some of these issues, but it makes a lot of sense to ask questions as you go, and it's certainly a way that I like to deliver these types of sessions. Delivering them in a video format like this, in a webinar format, makes it a little bit more difficult to get that level of interaction that we might otherwise want. But we'll do with it as we can. But if you want to type in a question to Amanda, and we go from there. Equally, I've got an additional challenge today where the powers that be have decided to turn the power off where I was going to deliver this from, so I'm in a different environment. So I'm working out how to go through the presentation without in a different environment. So we're working from there. What we want to talk about is largely around bullying and harassment. We know that we've talked about lots of these issues in the past. We're going to talk about the concept of that mentally healthy workplace and how that interacts with the prevention of bullying and harassment. We're going to talk about people's vulnerabilities. I'll go directly to that a little bit later without doing more with that. I'm going to talk about the law. The law is a significant component to all of this as well, but equally is the concept of morality in this process as well. And the impact that conflict has on these situations. So with that in mind, they're the sorts of things that we're looking to head to. You know, we know that in this environment we've got a whole bunch of scenarios, and we know that the bullying and harassment. Andrew Douglas in his session a couple of weeks ago talked about, gave a lot of discussion on what that really means, and those illegal things that occur, and those things that there are a level of protections against around bullying and discrimination and victimization. Andrew's talked about the vilification issues and the adverse action, and they're all about breaches of the law. And if we can get to the point in the future, at some point, where we can avoid those things becoming such an issue, then we're going to be significantly better off. And hopefully we can get to that point. And we know that bullying at this stage, the last set of data that we had talks about bullying being a $6 billion cost per annum. And really it's for no good reason. We go from there. But what is a mentally healthy workplace? And I suppose a mentally healthy workplace is really just one that's free from those issues that impact on someone's mental health. And to understand that, we need to consider what that good environment looks like. But the problem that we have is that good environment's not so easily defined. doesn't walk around with a banner on it. It doesn't have a great big flag out the front that says, "Hey, we're a good workplace. We do this." People are starting to try and do that and create those ways of representing it, but it's really hard to pick it up. You know when you're in it though that the environment's good. You know when you're in it that the environment's okay. Really quite difficult to understand what it is and what it might be that gets us to that point. It's far easier to understand what a bad environment's like. We all know probably more quickly that we're in a bad environment because it makes us feel unwell. It makes us feel unhealthy. It annoys us, gets us cranky. But when we're in a good environment, we kind of just accept it as the way it should be. So we don't necessarily acknowledge it in that same way, and that's something that's a bit of an issue. But a lot of what we're talking about today, I've drawn on a study that was done by the University of New South Wales along with the Black Dog Institute, and they did a lot of work around defining what a lot of these issues are, and they identified that a mentally healthy workplace is one where the risk factors are acknowledged and there's appropriate action taken to make sure that the negative impacts of those influences don't impact on a person's mental health. It acknowledges that we need to have protective and resilient factors in the workplace, and those are fostered and maximised, and acknowledging that mental health issues in a workplace are multifaceted and each workplace is going to be different. So we can't expect the same solution in one workplace as we might in another. So that again is part of our issue. But then how do we, that mentally healthy workplace, largely, how do we get there? Well, we need to establish protocols and that can identify a pathway to get to that mentally healthy workplace. We want to engage in processes that avoid those negative influences. We come back to, in part, why is this mentally healthy workplace important? And we're going to touch on this a few times. We're going to keep going back, and we're going to go a little bit circularly around this, where bullying and harassment and those sorts of workplace behaviours cannot exist in a mentally healthy workplace. So if we're going to avoid it, that's what we need to do. So we need to establish this mentally healthy workplace, and we need to make sure that we're there. But often people will say to me, well, why do I have to bother with this? Why should I care about that mentally healthy workplace? Staff's mental health problems are their own being. Surely those things that people carry within themselves are their responsibility. And that's kind of right. They are, to a large degree, their own responsibility. But as employers, it's really incumbent on us, as employers, as supervisors, as workmates, to not negatively impact on someone's mental health. It's reasonable for us to expect that a person's mental health is their own responsibility, but it's not our job necessarily to make them feel better by being at work. But most definitely it's our job and our obligation to not negatively impact on them and not negatively deal with their mental health. A whole bunch of reasons why we might do this. We get back to why this is an issue. And realised my screen is not doing what I want it to do. So that's how we can get there. We come to why is this an issue? Why do we need to worry about this so much? And we know this is a good question. The law says, as Andrew said earlier, well, last couple of weeks, the law says we should get there, and we've got a responsibility to do certain things and to look after people's well-being and their mental health. And there are penalties and sanctions if we don't, right? So, if we get these things wrong, then we will be prosecuted and that of itself is not good. We don't necessarily want to do these things. In Victoria, I was just reflecting a little bit earlier, part of the mental health and the bullying issues in Victoria have been dealt with by an amendment to the Crimes Act known as Brodie's Law, and that came out of some issues in a cafe some years ago, where one of the employees was bullied to the point where she ultimately committed suicide, and there were some significant fines in there. And that's an issue. And as I recall, I think correctly, some of the people involved in that went to jail. And that's all part of it. And the changes to the law as a result of Brodie's case resulted in the possibility for there to be 10 years jail. But I more than that, you know, there are fines, there are penalties. But if I say to you, and this is where the moral aspect of it comes in, if I say to you these names, Marcus Dela Cruz, Nicholas Smallwood, Reece McAlpine, and Gabriel Toomey, those names mean nothing, and I'm not slandering or speaking out badly about anyone. Those were the 4 men that will continually be named from this day, you know, from that day on, as being those people that were involved in that girl's death. So just the negative responses, the negative connotations that come from the cafe, which was a cafe called Cafe Vamp, obviously no longer exists. Just a reflection on the person and their place in history is enough to make us want to make sure that we don't go there. We know, of course, that people bring with them a whole bunch of issues. And we talked about that a little bit, but we know that mental health, you know, Black Dog came up with these couple of statements here. Mental health is now the leading cause of sickness and absence and long-term work in most developed countries. And we know that mental health conditions, we said that bullying costs $8 billion. Mental health conditions generally cost Australian businesses between 11 and 12. So if we think about, and we'll talk about difficult industries and the like in a moment, and trauma. So we think that mental health issues come from trauma. We think that mental health issues come from PTSD and the like. But if we're talking about 11 billion and 8 billion comes from bullying, 3 billion of it probably comes from those other traumatic things or other unrelated issues. Means almost, or a little over, 3/4 of it is coming from bullying and those types of things. We know that people come to us in our workplace with mental health issues. They come to us, you know, with their own genetics, you know, their own personalities, their own, you know, the things that have happened with them in their early lives and the way that they need to deal with those. They've got some lifestyle factors that may impact on their mental health potentially. But there's also their own individual level of resilience as well. And that all of those things they bring with them, and everybody is going to be impacted by these issues separately. And whilst we might say that, again, we said a little bit earlier, whilst we might say that we're not responsible for people's mental health, we know that they come with these things, and we know that there's this. There are circumstances where they're coming to us. This table gives a summary of the sorts of issues that we have. In the individuals have, you know, bring with them these issues that I just talked about, their genetics, their personality, and the like. And if they've got conflict at work or difficulties between their work-home balance, that can multiply the impact of those things. And then if they've got poor job designs or poor issues within their workplace, and we're going to talk a little bit about these things more later. There are not high quality interpersonal relationships in the workplace, and there is poor leadership, and there is a physical environment that is not safe for them, and there's a lack of organisational justice, which we'll talk about in a minute. All of those things will multiply the impact of those things that they bring to work with them. So it is not just issues of their own individual situation. That's what they bring with us, but it's how we impact on that, and it's the workplace that impacts on that. And then it's ultimately the outcome of those things that creates the overall mental health and well-being outcome. So whilst it's not necessarily our responsibility, a person's emotional well-being and emotional internal resources, whilst those are not necessarily our responsibility, the impact that we have on those through work is most certainly the responsibility of ours. People talk about, what's this mentally healthy workplace look like? Can it be, is it all unicorns and rainbows and pretty things like that? And that's what a lot of people might think of it as. And we sit around and we sing Kumbaya and we do all of these things and we do daisy chains at lunchtime. But my old mate here putting the locomotive carriages back together, those blokes are tough. They don't need to worry about these emotional things. They don't have to worry about that stuff. That's not an issue. And it's only those soft industries that can make their workplace mentally healthy. And us tough guys in that tough environment, it's not possible to have a mentally healthy workplace. Let me go back a bit. Is a mentally healthy workplace one that is free of conflict? That's what people will often say. Well, with no conflict, if there's no conflict, it must be healthy. Well, I don't know about that. Go to a sporting contest. Let's use football as an example. And we know that in a football match, it's going to be a level of aggression, probably potentially a level of violence in it as well. There's peer pressure. There's undoubtedly conflict in there. There's a degree of performance anxiety. Is that an unhealthy workplace? It can't be. It can't be an unhealthy workplace, in my opinion, because that's one of those, surely people would not desire to work in an unhealthy workplace. Surely an unhealthy workplace wouldn't be one that people want to be there where they spend their adult life. Kids look at that sporting contest and that's what they want to be. When I grow up, I want to be an elite sportsman. I want to be in a football match, regardless of the code of football. So it's not conflict of itself that creates necessarily those issues. So it's about the type of conflict, and it's about the complexity and the interaction of all of these things that are sent to us. Those are the things that make it unhealthy. It's not the manliness of the job or the aggression that might be in there or the conflict that might occur. It's about the regularity and the complexity and how those things impact on each other. So, we come back. How do we get there? How do we get to this point of having a mentally healthy workplace? And a lot of it comes from, and we'll take you through a short journey. Coming out of the Industrial Revolution, it was all about getting more done, getting it done faster, getting it done cheaper, and getting it done arguably in some ways better, but more about more, faster and cheaper. And that was our focus, and it was about production. It was about production at all costs, and we didn't really care that much about, well, care is probably a bad word. We didn't focus as much on issues around how it was impacting on our people. We didn't deal with those things as quickly, and still until we started to notice things. And we removed the spinning blades, and we know that people were going into environments where there were machines that were thumping and the like. I want to share a story. Back some years ago, in Melbourne, there was a manufacturing facility. It was a facility where they manufactured women's underwear. Might have just been underwear. It doesn't necessarily need to have been women's underwear. But they had a row of sewing machines, and it was row upon row upon row of sewing machines, and they had 2 lights above that machine. They had a red light and a green light, and you know, they had one light they would pull when they started to run out of material to make the underwear, because the intention was that these ladies, and it was pretty much from memory all ladies, they were just, those machines were to go to be running the whole time. If you started to run out of material, you pulled the light switch and somebody would run up and provide you with another set of material so you could continue. The intention was that you just went and went and went. There was another light that you pulled if you needed to take a break and go to the toilet. And in those circumstances, one of the supervisors would jump in, take over your machine so that it would continue to run. You would race off to the toilet and you would get back. There was no time for you to have a break. The work output was constant. Because the supervisor would have to jump in and be taken away from their other activities, it was frowned upon. So if you were to go, you really needed to go. The outcome of that was that 23% of their staff every single year was having an injury that caused them to have at least a week off work. That means that every single employee in that place was injured within a space of 4 years. So over the course of 4 years, everybody was going to be hurt to the point where they had to take a week off work. The vast majority were off work for far more than a week. You know, the vast majority were off for 6, 8, 12, 3 months, 3 years, right? The outcome of that was that morale was non-existent. Their output plummeted. They couldn't get decent staff because nobody wanted to work there. It had a reputation of being a terrible place to be. And their insurance premiums doubled each year for 5 years until eventually they could no longer exist. That's not the dark ages. That was only 30 years ago, right? And that was the sort of thing that made us refocus on what we do. And our modern OHS activity started to stem from there. It's a story that doesn't sound like it's got much to do with mental health, but it's exactly the same. You know, that basis of our risk assessment, that basis of identifying those ongoing contributors to that physical unwellness of those people is the exact same process that we should identify and go through to identify those contributors to people's emotional unhealth. And we go from there. And we go and we identify those issues of, you know, that stock standard risk assessment where we identify the regularity of the occurrence and how often it occurs, and then multiplying that by the potential outcome. You know, we know the way we do those general OHS assessments. It is no different. It is no different to the concept of a mentally healthy workplace and identifying those risk factors and hazards, the hazards and the level of risk that come into those. So if that's what we do, and we talk about how we find that place and how we get there, well, what do we do? We identify what we need to do. We identify what those issues are that are facing us and creating unhealthiness, and we can push them down that path. So we then need to start to work on issues around the design of the job. So understand how we do things, how we work on those things, and how and what we might do to establish the way we do work and what we can do from there. We then come to the stage of looking at those issues of, you know, as I said, designing the job, those issues around those team and group factors that we'll talk about briefly. Those organisational factors, the organisational factors that come in to the process, issues with the individuals, and then the organisational level. What can we do as an organisation to put these protections in place, and then looking at enhancing resilience, and getting people to get some help in the first stage is really important. When we talk about that design of the job, we need to know that, you know, we've got, you know, the demands that are there are the right way of going about things. And we know that jobs that have those higher emotional demands are more likely to have an impact on people. So if we can limit those demands to the point where people feel like they're in control of that job rather than having the job control them. That's really important, and a really important way of maintaining that level of appropriateness. We need to make sure that, you know, from a resources point of view, that people have the level of resource and engagement within their daily job, within their occupation, to be able to perform their work, that they have the ability to craft their own experience in this process, and they have the right supports in the workplace that are able to reduce some of those otherwise negative impacts. And they get feedback. So, you know, high quality work is about getting feedback from others around you and from the work itself. You know, if we don't necessarily see the benefit of what we do, we all know, everyone, all of us have built something, whether it was a sandcastle on the beach as a child, or a back shed, or a kitchen, or a whatever. We all see the outcome of those activities that we do. If we're not seeing those sorts of things, then that's quite difficult to feel as though we belong to and are engaged in the complete process of that work. And in that way, it's about being able to, as much as possible, see the whole of what we do, rather than just seeing a piece of what we do. We can't always do that, but so long as we're aware of what our contribution to the overall activity is, that's a very useful thing. And it's that task significance and the meaningfulness of that work, and the autonomy and you know, discretion to do some of those things ourselves, and to identify some of the issues that we want to do. We know that with some of those basic characteristics, though, you know, the more we have of them, you know, the more good we have, the better. But you know, there's only so much, and we know that, you know, there is a point where more of the good stops having an impact and it just becomes more of the same. It's like when we're hungry, for example, we might get to the point where, you know, we'll eat until we're no longer hungry and we get that benefit. But once you go past the point of being full, you're getting no further benefit. So, you know, we know that those job characteristics only deal with some aspects of that well-being. We know also that when we're designing these jobs, that regular exposure to trauma is obviously a risk factor. In a lot of organisations, like the police, for example, or ambulance operators, or people, particularly in a trauma environment like an emergency department in a hospital, that regular exposure to trauma can be something that has a negative impact on people's mental health as we go. So that's something that we need to make sure that we're able to address, and that we have those additional supports for those people to make sure that it doesn't get above them. There are some factors that are within a group that are really important, and so, you know, we know what a bad group looks like. We know what a bad team looks like. To a large degree, we know what a good team can look like as well. But some of the difficulties are, if we can see that good team from the outside, we may start to consider that if we can only see it from the outside, then we're not so included in the group. So that's not necessarily what we want in that organisation as well. We want that team and that group to be supportive. And we know that when we're working in a work environment, that support that we might get from colleagues and managers is really important. The support that we get from within that group is one of those things that sustains us and has us being able to continue to work. We know that when we are supportive amongst ourselves and we provide that constant ongoing team-based process to support each other, then we're going to end up with a better outcome. And the interpersonal relationships within that group are equally important. We know that there are always going to be interpersonal relationships within these groups. It is by its very nature. We're all people, so we've got to relate. But we know that there will be part of that. There will be conflict because not everybody's going to get along. So we need to understand what that conflict might look like, and how we can best deal with that. you know, if it's a case of identifying those sorts of things early, then we should do that, because if we don't, then it's that often that type of conflict that can turn into either perceived or actual bullying or harassment. If we are working as a group and we're dealing with issues collectively, we're going to be able to call out and identify those things and not allow them to grow and start to become a negative on our environment. The organisation as itself needs to be able to deal with these things, and those organisational factors are kind of the culture and the climate within an organisation. And it's about how we do things here. You know, it's how we do things in this organisation. What do we do, and how do we deal with things? And one of those first things that we deal with is organisational change. And we know that people do not deal with change well. People would prefer not to have to change. People are generally creatures of habit. And so change makes it difficult for people and makes them feel uncomfortable. For example, if we're going through a downsizing process or a redundancy process or dealing with those sorts of things, people need to face some of their own career transition issues, and that can start to create issues. It can also start to increase issues around injury, physical injury and absence from work, and these things themselves will add to the issues around mental health and well-being. And we know that particularly in these sorts of circumstances, people can start to take on almost a fight or flight type mentality, where they need to start to, in some instances, push back and create some specific behaviours themselves that they might see as being protective of their own future, which can turn into those harassing, bullying behaviours that are the types of behaviours that we don't want in our environment. And we know that these types of things can go on in an organisation for 10 years after the event of it. So we know that one of the most significant things that we can do in times of change, and we've identified in the past circumstances where when people are moved on from an organisation or they are made redundant, you know, we'll often offer them outplacement services, and we work them through the process. We might offer them counselling processes, and what we need to do is make sure that we're offering that same sort of support to the survivors in the process, because they are equally traumatised through change. And in some instances, in a redundancy process, they might see some of the people they've worked with for a very long time leaving the organisation, and they will suffer a sense of loss as part of that as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well, a little bit more. Sometimes the organisational support that we have within an organisation is really important, as we talked about, and because people will often, provide, give, offer up, family type characteristics to their workplace. Their workplace becomes very much like their family, and that can become an issue of support for them as well. And that's something that if there's more of, the better we are. We need to make sure that we're recognising and rewarding people's work. It's not just, it's about, paying them fairly and paying them on time and responding to issues that arise. But it's not just money, it's not just bonuses, and it's not just pay rises or career opportunities. It's about how we recognise and how we reward and how we acknowledge a job well done. Sometimes, in many circumstances, being told a job's well done, at least in the short term, has as much, if not more, impact than a pay rise. Pay rises obviously have a longer standing impact, but that initial, the sense of achievement by being told I've done well, is significant. And again, if that's the culture and that's the climate that we work in, and that's the way, as I said before, the way we do things, then that's going to have a positive impact. Importantly is this issue of organisational justice. We touched on this a little bit earlier, and that's about the fairness of those rules within the place. One of the things that is really important in all organisations is that there is a level of justice, that the rules apply to everybody. When people perceive that there are different rules for different people, that can create a significant impact on the mental health of people within that workplace. And by mental health, we're talking about the emotional impact that it has on people. Whether that's valid or not is irrelevant. It's the impact is there, and that mental health challenge is there and is facing people. And we know that it is really important to make sure that the outcome of an act undertaken by one person results in the same treatment of them as it would for anybody else. Talked about the organisational climate a fair bit. And it sounds like, again, one of those soft, lovey things that we go. And we know that the impact around the place, the way, the vibe of the place is significant. We know that we feel better on a warm, sunny spring day than we do as I looked out the window here at the clouds and the rain and the darkness and the wind. It doesn't make me feel the same way, and an organisation is no different to that. The psychosocial safety climate within an organisation is really important, and that's the way, again, the way we do things. It's the climate within the place. It's the way senior management in the organisation care and respond to that level of stress prevention and people's well-being. It's about the participation by managers in those processes and making sure that we're communicating up and down the organisation in an effective way. If we can do that, then we're significantly better off. And if our physical environment is appropriate, we are going to feel better about ourselves. If we're frightened the whole time that we're working in an environment that we might get hurt in, that is going to have a negative impact on me as well. We talked about individual factors. We know that home work conflict is significant. We know that there are a range of these types of things that are going to impact on us. And we know that home work conflict can be a real challenge to us. We know that particularly if people don't want to be at work, then those issues that are happening at home will have an even greater impact on them emotionally. If work is not encouraging, supporting and decent, then the outcome of those impacts on their mental health is significant. We know that people are going to continually turn over. When there's a lot of turnover in an organisation, that's a self-fulfilling circumstance. Other people will continue to leave because some are, if that makes sense. The more people leave, the more other people are likely to leave, is what I'm saying. And that of itself creates a level of uncertainty amongst people within the workplace. And we know that these individual factors within the workplace can be significant. There are a whole bunch of external influences from work that are dealing with the individual. For example, we know that substance misuse and alcohol is more common amongst those with mental health challenges. We know that those mental health issues can exacerbate those behaviours, and we know that there are some environments that promote that type of activity, and that can also be a major barrier to getting somebody well again after they've suffered a mental health issue, or getting them back to work as part of that mental health process. So we need to consider that there may be circumstances where those workplace behaviours need to be modified to take into account some of those issues with those individuals. We know that in an organisation, we need to manage work effectively. We've talked about designing it and getting it right. We know that as we monitor the way work is done, and we monitor the way we design work in the initial stages, that we can get a better understanding of how it may impact on people. We know today that we don't just put somebody onto a a sewing machine, as we talked about before, onto a particular part of a boning line and just have them flat stick doing that job minute upon minute upon minute for a whole shift. We know that that's going to result in a physical injury. And so we design other controls into that type of work. It's the same with a mental health issue as well. And we know that, equally with an ongoing, slowly developing wrist injury, for example, we know that, in a mental health perspective, people don't go from being healthy one minute to being unhealthy the next. There are signs and there are processes we go through we go along that journey. So we need to consider that as we go. We know that there are some effective long-term strategies that we can identify as part of the process. And I've lost a table here. So we know, if we look at this table, and this table's in the workbook, we know that as we design jobs for the people, that job design is really important in that first bit. And we know that when the person starts healthy and we design that job properly, then we will keep people well. If we then get to the stage where our team and our organisational processes promote those protective factors, then we're going to keep them. We're going to keep them well, and that's our barrier to that next stage. Once we start to slip in those around those secondary interventions, when somebody starts to become symptomatic or at risk, we know that at that point, if we start to work on enhancing their resilience or otherwise trying to give them some support through that process, and that might be in a physical sense, it might be a massage process or a physio process, the same sorts of sharing and management control is important in a mental health aspect. We can keep people at work and we can help those symptomatic people to stay well, but we can get them that early help as we go through that stage 4. And then at that point, hopefully we've avoided that transition into a mental illness. But if we do, then we need to then start to work on their recovery from that mental illness. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, because what we want to do is get there in time to stop it becoming that sickness and that leave from work. So if we can design and manage that work in an appropriate way, we know that we're going to be better off. We know that we then need to have these effective ongoing strategies in place to make sure that we're able to control what they do, and we can make sure that we're building that climate. We're developing policies that avoid the development of those bullying type aspects. We can promote those team-based interventions, because we know that if the best thing that we've got is the support of that team around us. And if we can ensure that those colleagues are there and working with us and helping us all along, then we're going to be significantly better off. We talked about building that psychosocial safety climate that is really important as part of that process. We know that by having that in place, by having those support mechanisms, and we talked about what they are, then that's really important. We know that as we design and manage work, which we've managed somehow to put that heading in there twice. So I don't know why that heading's in there twice, but what I wanted to talk about was that we know, as part of that sharing and part of that monitoring, we know that the bullying is bullying issues are in the hands of the doer. It's the bully that is potentially the problem, or he's likely to be the problem. But if we've got controls in place to avoid that type of behaviour from getting out of hand, and we've got people identifying those issues as they start to occur, we're going to provide that protective safety climate that avoids these issues becoming a problem. We need to go through issues where we're coaching and we're mentoring our staff. We know that we're sharing with people, we're sharing the process, we're coaching our managers, we're providing our supervisors with those learnings, and they're able to identify things. And we need to specifically, formally provide training for managers and leaders in the workplace. We know that the more managers become and other leaders become comfortable with what they should do and how they should do things and when they can act and how they should act, then the more likely they are to do it. And then if we get into a circumstance where we are managing all of those leaders, then they are going to be in a position to be able to support each other as they go, and that collegiate approach will ensure that people are getting the right sort of support and the right sort of monitoring. We will be more protective and we will end up in a better place. And as I said before, managing change is really important. So as an organisation, if we get that change management process in place and we are sharing from those managers and those other leaders within the organisation are communicating by as many channels as they possibly can, then we're going to be better off. I wanted to talk about enhancing resilience amongst the people. Right, that's the really important thing that we can do here. We know that people will everybody have a different level of resilience, have a different level of exposure to things, but it's not just a case of turning to people within our workplace and saying, you should toughen up, Charlie. It's not that. People's level of resilience is within themselves. And we know that regardless of a person's level of resilience, that level of resilience is going to impact on the outcome of the behaviours that occur in the workplace. So even if some of those behaviours slip through, in some circumstances, people are going to be able to deal with it and people are going to be okay. But in some instances, sometimes when those behaviours slip through, it will have potentially a greater impact on some people than others. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to be in a position where we can deal with it. There are arguments around resilience training, and people have put the position of specific resilience training for staff over many years. The evidence as to whether or not that's valuable is pretty weak. It's very difficult to train resilience into a person, and if we try and do that, then it's of benefit. But our ongoing provision of levels of support ensures that we will improve a person's level of resilience, a person's capability of dealing with those issues as we go. We know we talked again about manager training, and manager training in this regard is really important. If those managers are taught how to help build that level of resilience within their staff, by dealing with managers and giving them the right tools and the right training to be able to support their teams, I think that's really important in ensuring that there's that resilience there. Giving them the ability to identify when somebody might be struggling, and rather than pushing them harder, identifying what might need to happen to be able to bring them back into place. There are a whole bunch of resources that we can put in place for those managers to assist them to do those things. And there is, just as we know that physical activity programs on a work site, in a workplace, really can have a level of impact on people's physical well-being, it can actually have a significant mental health well-being benefit as well. We know that, and there are some examples of casino organisations that have done some really good studies in the past of what this does. We know that they identified some physical activity programs to deal with physical injuries for croupiers and the like, but they discovered at the same time there were some significant benefits from people's their mental health within the organisation as well. Probably goes back in large part to what we were talking about earlier in that group, and that group aspect. And when we're all working together and we're all collegiate and we're all trying to hold each other up, and we're all working so closely together, it's likely that it comes from that. It is likely that by working in that environment, we're going to be significantly better off. we talked back previously about that early help seeking. We can't know that someone's struggling generally, because as human beings, we are really good maskers a lot of the time, particularly the so-called tough blokes, are apparently really good at masking our emotions and masking our struggles. And so that can be really, really difficult. And we're limited in what we can do if we're not aware that people are struggling or that they're being negatively impacted by things. All we can do is promote that early help seeking, promote that are you okay type thing. And it's not about wandering around and asking everybody how they are. It's being aware of our environment. It's being aware of those people around us and noticing changes in people. You know, we can go through and identify doing those well-being checks and that health screening, and that can help us with some of these issues, but it's not going to necessarily rapidly identify those issues where people are more likely to be the subject of, you know, mental health unwellness, and those can be issues. You know, we know that we could do some screening and you know, weed out those people that are suffering from, you know, the common mental health issues that the vast majority of people suffer from, a level of anxiety, a level of depression. You know, we can deal with some of those things, but does that really provide us with the sort of workplace we want? Maybe, maybe not. We know that employee assistance programs can be really useful. I'm a great believer in the use of an employee assistance program, and Simon and others and I have had constant conversations about this. Again, I'm a very, very strong believer in the use of an employee assistance program with one rider, that you use it right. I've seen so many circumstances where managers who haven't been trained, as we talked about a minute ago, when somebody comes to them with some concerns, with some discomfort, some emotional problems in their world, they come to us and the manager hands them an EAP card and says, "Here, go and talk to these guys." What I as the person suffering hear from that is, and this is probably not why it was done, but I probably hear, he doesn't want to help me, he doesn't care about me, I'm just a number, they don't care. Mental health first aids processes and the like suggest that one of the most important things that you can do is listen first and then offer some help, right? Interrupting someone to give them a card might make you feel like you've done something. We need to train managers to the point where they're comfortable with listening. They're comfortable with not doing anything. We don't have to be Superman straight away and fix everything. We can just stop and hear. If we use our EAP properly, we're able to identify a process where after a traumatic event, and we know that traumatic events are, you know, I deal with issues around trauma and emergency departments and the like, but you know, I know in the meat industry we might have a circumstance where, you know, I've seen recently circumstances where somebody has suffered an amputation of a finger, and then all of those people around that person have been the subject of that trauma as well. We deal with the person that suffered the injury, but do we deal with that response to those other people that are dealing with that traumatic event as well? Something that we need to do. And if we structure our EAP program, or whatever we call it, if we structure it in the right way, then we can use that as a response to those traumatic events. We don't do that group debrief that was done in the past, because evidence has shown that that's not the way we deal with things, and that's not the way we avoid PTSD scenarios. But it's more about that initial emotional support to those people and letting them know that there's someone there that's prepared to help them through whatever it is that they might be thinking, and provide them with that process. we need to make sure that what we do is get people along that journey. You know, we know that we want them to start to recover. We want people to get to a situation where we know that there's an end game here. We know that there is a process where hopefully they will start to get better. If we can identify, or if we can increase the awareness within the organisation of mental illness and deal with those types of destigmatizing approaches, we're going to be significantly better off. You know, I talk about issues in the past about why this is so hard, and we know that it's, you know, it's really difficult to deal with this stuff. We know that managers struggle with it, and it's because in part the stigma in the workplace. We know statistics tell us that if I tell you that I've got a mental health problem, then the likelihood of me getting the job is only 50%, because people don't want to deal with it. And we as managers, we as people struggle to deal with those emotional issues. There are some of us that are drawn to that type of interaction, but those people generally get drawn to those caring type careers and processes and jobs, and become, you know, the nurses and the psychologists and those that are there to help us. You know, for the rest of us, we don't get it. You know, we're frightened a lot by this, and managers, unless they're trained and are made comfortable in this process, will so often be afraid of dealing with that issue, and push back against it. They really truly struggle to deal with it because we don't like tears. You know, we don't deal well with these types of issues. And so if we're not trained, if our managers are not in a position to deal with these things, they are going to struggle.
And Jay, I think just as an extra value add, we've had a comment come in rather than a question around, it's also about keeping the confidentiality is very important, is the key to being able to work through the issues. This person that's put this through said at a previous workplace where they were working, there was an employee with mental health issues, and it was almost broadcasted and within a week all staff knew what was going on, and within a month they had resigned. So keeping that confidentiality is important, and that's a really good example of that.
No, absolutely, and that's that team-based and organisational thing that we're talking about, because that's a bad outcome. That person going is potentially a bad outcome. Let's assume that we wanted to keep them, but the worst outcome of that is the impact that has on everybody else, because is the next person going to come and tell you there's a problem? And I can assure you, if one person's got a problem, somebody else probably does as well. Somebody else probably does. These types of problems are rarely a one-off, and if you're not going to deal with them properly and effectively and keep them confidential in that way, then you're going to struggle and you're not going to deal with it. Just to sum up and just to close, there's in the workbook, we've gone through and identified all of these strategies, but it's about to get it to work. We've got to establish that commitment and support in the first place. Right? We need to identify the issues within the workplace, identify what is it that we've got at the moment, what are the things that we're potentially dealing with. How do we get that strategy in place from that point on? How are we going to get to where we want to be? Then once we've been on that journey, we go through the process, and it's no different. This is no different to our overall health and safety process. We review it. We know we go down the journey, we review it, and if it's not 100% right, then we adjust it. Right? Once we've adjusted it, then at some point, and we might be 2 years down the track by this stage, we review our processes again. We review our situation, and we see where we are, and hopefully we're in a better place than when we started. But we go through the process again. If we want to move to another place, and hopefully we can move to an even better place, we start the journey again. In essence, that's what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to close finally with one of the things that AMPC has done as part of this support to its members is build this risk and advisory line that AEGIS to support AMPC in doing this is managing in conjunction with AMIC. And so for any of these types of workers' comp issues or any workplace safety issues, any of these mental health well-being processes, call us. The number's there. The number will be sent out again. We will answer that call, and we will direct you either to, it will come to our AEGIS office, and we'll then triage that and identify who the best person might be to speak to that, whether it's in relation to a HR or an IR thing, where we'll get one of the guys from AMIC to give you a call back as soon as possible, or whether it might be me or Simon Booth to be able to deal with those workplace safety or workers' comp or mental health issues. We're really keen to do that. You'll see that there are a whole bunch of issues there that we're happy to work on and assist with. I think that is the last of my slides. I've gone to exactly 60 minutes, Amanda.
Perfect, well done, Jay. So we've got a question that's come in. If a bullying situation turns into physical conflict and knives are drawn,
Yep.
What is the best way for a manager to respond, intervene?
Yeah, good question. By staying safe themselves, first up. You did say knives, so I assume they've each got one. The intervention in that is to ensure that everybody is kept safe, that you are kept safe, that you don't put yourself in harm's way. You allow the protagonists to deal with it as they do. You can't put yourself in place. You would then, I expect, call the police straight up. And then the aftermath of that will be whatever your policy says about those sorts of behaviours in the workplace. Hopefully you've got one. Hopefully you've got a misconduct type policy, and you would deal with that in that way. I assume that's the question. If it's about should I step in between the two knife flailing assailants, my answer would generally be no. You need to make sure that you're safe first.
Great, thanks for that, Jay.
I hope that answers the question. The really difficult circumstance to be in.
Absolutely, and let's hope no one has to actually be involved in that sort of a circumstance. So just in closing,
I have seen it happen. I have seen it happen in the meat industry, and I did what I said you should do.
Yep, great.
Keep everybody else safe and let them deal with it.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you very much for today's webinar, Jay. We really appreciate all the time and effort that AEGIS have put into developing this series of webinars, and I think everyone that was on board today watching the webinar will be able to take away some good key messages that you've sent through. So the webinar has been recorded. For anybody that wants a copy, we will be sending out a copy of it as well as a copy of the workbook by tomorrow, this time tomorrow afternoon at the latest. You should receive them, and if you haven't, please feel free to get in contact with me. And our next webinar is scheduled for the 15th of October, where we will have Steve from AMIC, who will be doing part 7 of our safety session, which will be bullying and harassment and the investigation process. So we look forward to working through that webinar in terms of the investigation and how you go about a bullying and harassment, which can sometimes be quite challenging. So I look forward to hearing from Steve on that. So Jay, you've managed to not get too many questions today, so you've done extremely well. You've gone perfectly on time. So once again, thank you very much for all your efforts. And if anyone does have any further follow-up questions that they would like to specifically ask Jay, feel free to contact either Jay or Simon at AEGIS Insurance via the hotline. Is probably the best way to do it, that 1300 761 891 number. And they'll be more than happy to talk to you about your individual needs. So thanks everyone, and enjoy your afternoon.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.